want to show you how to do a little detail work, and what I always sort of say, my mantra is that you should be constructing details, not just drawing in the clay. So for example, I had 2 pinch pots put together, kind of created this basic shape of maybe what will be an animal or something. To make an eye, I could simply draw an eye into the clay. Couple problems with this. Number one, I'm using a pen tool. It's the worst tool to carve with unless you want really super fine detail. And secondly, it just kind of looks like it's been drawn in there. Even if I was to go back and maybe add like some texture or something, it's okay, but it's not going to look as great as if I construct it. So here's what I mean by constructing details. I'm going to make an eye. An eyeball is round. So why wouldn't I actually try to make a round eyeball? I could slip and score that eyeball into the socket. Notice I made sockets, so I manipulated the clay. That will also look better than just drawing an eyeball on a flat spot. So I made a socket. I could slip and score, pretend like I scored that eyeball in. I might use some tools to carve and create texture and detail. So I'm not going to use the pen tool. I hate that tool for carving. A pencil's great, a ballpoint pen, the curved end of a blade tool is good too. And so I might actually go back and still kind of carve the iris, that's the colored part. I might actually poke a hole for the pupil, the black part. I might go back and use some other tool that I find to create like a little linear texture. You know how most people's eyes kind of radiate out the colored part? So I can create that little radial texture. And this, I'm doing this very quickly, you would spend more time on it, but the idea is I can still carve into the clay to create detail, but I'm doing it on an actual eyeball. And then what will make this look even better, so already it looks a little cooler than just drawing into it, although it looks a little freaky too. I can even add eyelids. So think about your eye, it's made with a ball with a lid right on top. So why can't I make a little eyelid? Roll a little coil, flatten it out. This is going to be the edge of my eyelid. And you might need to make it like a small strip of clay, or it could be larger, it depends on what you're making. But if I take this little eyelid and I set it right here on top of my eye, and then I blend the back part in, but I don't touch the part that's the actual lid, the front of the lid. And if I can't do it with a tool, right? And the idea is I'm doing this super quickly, and I'm going to get just a little moisture on my finger to smooth, so use my wet sponge for a little moisture. I'm doing this super quickly, but in like 1 minute's time, I've probably already created an eye that looks way cooler than the drawn one, right? This is a constructed detail. This is a drawn detail. And the difference is 3rd grade, high school. And this is what we want, okay? And I could add a lower lid, I could add wrinkles, I could do other things. Another tip for details. I'm making ears for this dude, or a tongue, or it's the petals of a flower, the leaves of a flower. Let's say I have a flat piece of clay that I've either flattened with my hands or rolled, and I'm gonna cut that shape out. So I'm gonna cut an ear out for this guy. When I cut the clay out, I have this, what looks like an ear, but it also looks fresh cut, kind of like I took a cookie cutter and just cut it. So what I encourage you to always do is finish your edges. So instead of just putting this cookie cutter ear and slipping and scoring it on, why don't I go back with a wet finger and I can actually smooth these edges, soften them, round them, make them look more natural, like a real ear would be. Okay, because the real ear of a pig or whatever this weird monster thing is not going to be super sharp and cornered and square like that other one was. And so now, whether this is the petal of a flower, the leaf, an ear, could be anything like that, a tentacle or something, a fish tail, it now looks a little bit more sculpted and it looks a little more natural than if I just cut it out and it looks cookie cutter. And I think that's a really important thing to do when you're thinking about details is before I start slipping, scoring them on, can I make that detail constructed the best I can? And that includes your edges. So think about constructing, think about edges, and then the final thing would be textures. If I'm adding textures, yeah, I can always carve fish scales in with a pin tool, which is not ideal, or some other carving tool like this, and that looks fine. But notice the difference between these two lines. I don't know if you can see the difference between these two lines, but one is a deeper, wider carving, and one's a really skinny linear carving. The deeper, wider will be better for glazing. And there's sometimes don't be afraid to experiment. Sometimes there's faster, easier ways to do something. So I can create a lot of scales very quickly by impressing something into the clay instead of drawing into it. So I encourage you to find things to create textures where you impress instead of draw. And you can also build textures. It sounds insane, but I could actually put on these scales or feathers one at a time. If I slip and score this whole area, and then I create these little balls of clay and I smush just the back on. So let me get a few going and you'll see what happens. Smush just the back on. And then I start to overlap them and I'm smushing just the back on. And I might need to re-slip and score a little bit. What you'll find is that you're actually building a scaly texture and it looks literally usually 10 times better. Okay, so I'll just do a little bit more here and then you'll get a better idea of what I'm talking about when I hold it up for comparison. And so the idea is this is a constructed texture, this is a drawn texture, this is an impressed texture. They all look fine. You have to figure out what works best for you, but a lot of times it pays to take time to do constructed texture. It turns really out cool, really well for feathers, scales, other kinds of things. That's their basics on textures and details. Think about constructing them and not just drawing into the